When you move towards collective liberation, towards dismantling systems of oppression, you will lose people, places, and things. And the grief of that, the cost of that, the impact of that is not something that we talk a lot about in movement. It's impacted me in a lot of ways. There have been so many relationships that I have lost. The more that I have leaned into collective liberation, the more that I have leaned into what being my most freest self looks like. There have been so many collective events that have also called into question, I think, a lot of our relationships. And maybe you too resonate with losing people and grieving and being frustrated and angered. So we'll get into that today and talk about some of that impact, talk about some of the things that may have caused us to lose our relationships. And how do we build community in the face of this loss? Before we begin, my name is Carolyn Collado, and welcome to Recovery for the Revolution, the podcast where we decondition, decolonize, and get ready for the revolution together through recovery as a resistance practice. We are inherently interconnected and interdependent as human beings. We inherently depend on each other to survive. Like the food that I consumed today was collected and picked and prepared and delivered to the grocery store and stocked by different people. The internet that I'm broadcasting this to you on, the devices that I'm using to record this episode, somebody made those. And this is a system that tries to be like, oh yeah, you can be independent, like you don't need anybody. But we do. We inherently depend on each other for our survival. We are inherently interconnected. And shout out to Toy Smith for being one of my early teachers about this. We are inherently interconnected and interdependent. But capitalism wants us to forget that. Capitalism, colonization, systems of oppression know that we are also a very social species. And so they threaten us in terms of our relationship with connection, with community, if we don't follow the rules set by systems of oppression, if we don't act in accordance in the ways that these systems expect us to. They tell us that we will lose people. They make that very clear. And also threaten our access to resource. Like I said, we inherently depend on each other to survive. And so capitalism says, if you are not in accordance with these systems of oppression, you might not be able to do capitalism. And then how will you survive? That's what they try to sell us. But we've also seen that there are so many communities and movements of people who are surviving and moving together. We need each other to get out of this system. And so we'll be talking more about that later in the episode. So it's important for me to name what I'm coming into the room with as I'm talking about this, in terms of the things that I was brought up with that I had to move away from. So I was raised upper middle class. I grew up in predominantly white institutions. For those of you who can't see me or, aren't familiar with me, I am Afro-Indigenous. I am of the Caribbean. I'm Dominican, the child of immigrants. I am first generation American. I was brought up under cis heterosexual norms and with a lot of notions around fear, around ableism and disability and the impacts of that in capitalism, and with a lot of respectability politic as part of how I was conditioned to survive capitalism. I was told that I would have to perform twice as hard to get half as far, and really growing up with a lot of pressure of being perfect, because perfection was the only way to survive these systems. And to be perfect was to try to meet the norms of these systems as much as possible. And so that was deeply painful. And those experiences and the experiences of those losses, as I have moved towards what the greatest freedom for me and for collective looks like, there's been a lot of loss for me, but also a lot of freedom on the other side, but a lot of loss. This is so informed by so much grief, so much pain, and so many relationships that have fallen away in this process, all this relational shedding, as I tend to call it. So much relational shedding as I have become more and more myself and more free, or pursuing our collective freedom. Queerness was one of the earliest ways that I saw that if I stepped out of the norms of what was expected for me, that I would lose people. Colonization and capitalism reinforced that, there's only binary gender, man and woman, and there are roles that they should play. And, men should only sleep with women and women should only sleep with men in the context of marriage. And, grew up Catholic too. That was also big. That's me laughing in Catholic pain. Those were the norms and expectations. And, society really established that. Like, if you do not abide by these norms, like, you might lose your family, you might lose relationships to people around you. That's why the highest population of like young people who are housing insecure are LGBTQIA two spirit plus folks, because that home, the family, is one of the first places that we see that there are ramifications if we do not follow these social norms. So people get ousted by their family, or that's where the relationship with the family like might begin to tarnish because the family is upholding or holding these norms around patriarchy and how things are supposed to be. And there would be too much shame, there would be too much of this discordance with what this religion has told me or what society has told me things should be. And here is my kid defying those norms. And what does that mean? So for a lot of us, and for myself included, like, this can be one of those big grief points of, wow, I am going to defy this social norm. And that is going to cost me something. That's going to cost me my relationships. That's going to cost me people around me, people that I grew up with. Like, there's so much like bullying a lot of us experience, right? And it's like, if we are that, if we lean into our queerness, our transness, the bullying like may intensify. Like, it's just, that policing of who we are being so loud. And, concurrently for me, I just think a lot about also race, like race and expectations of white supremacy and performance of white supremacy. Again, I told you I grew up with a lot of respectability notions, right? So it was like I had to have that perfect like Dominican blowout. I had to wear these like upper middle class clothes, and, I had to be prim and proper and feminine in all the ways that like would be under the guise of what was acceptable, but not too much, because then I would be like that sexy Latina or like that angry Black woman. Like, it would be too much. And these confines are so exhausting and so dreadful. So dreadful. But it is like this notion that if we do not follow these, like, we may be isolated from our communities, from our families, from our norms. I grew up in predominantly white environments. I was told that that was like what I had to do, right? I had to go and try to achieve the best, and the best was within these white institutions. And so all of that, the patriarchal norms, the white supremacy norms, all of that conflating and being so intense, and all of my relationships being informed by being around white people, around performing what does middle class norms look like, around performing like these patriarchal expectations, was so utterly exhausting. But it was also just day-to-day life for me. That was like what I just adjusted to and just was living, because that's what I was conditioned to do. And really, my recovery journey was such a call to really look at the ways that trying to lean into liberalism and upholding these norms of trying to fit in, of trying to like comply with the systems, like how much that cost me. I got sober in Alcoholics Anonymous. At the time that I was there, the most recent survey showed that Alcoholics Anonymous was 80% white. And Alcoholics Anonymous has, present tense, this norm, this tradition that says that talking about race in the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous is not, like, it's an outside issue. It's not allowed. It's not recommended. It's not, condoned. And that was so, it was like ripping shreds inside of me, because I could tell as I was getting sober that so much of what I had struggled with throughout my life was how much the cost of not being myself was, how much the toll of upholding white supremacy, of like straightening my hair with that like Dominican blowout, and like burning my scalp, like, and burning my beautiful hair to like get it to conform to this white norms, like how much that had cost me, and the anticipation and that feeling of not being enough under these systems, but yet having to go and try to navigate these institutions anyway, try to establish and be enough to, get a leg into these liberal institutions that maybe I could make change if I just contorted myself enough that I could get to that point of making change in the government, in, societal expectations, if I just contorted myself enough. And it's like, wow, saying that out loud is like really poignant. Honestly, right now, I like want to cry, but that was true. That's really what I lived through and was carrying on a day-to-day basis. And so getting sober, realizing that that was making me sick, that I was using alcohol to try to like cope with and navigate being in those predominantly white like spaces with those expectations, and being in an institution that was telling me that if I would talk about those things, that was wrong, and being told that by my sponsor, by other like senior members in the program, was so harmful. And it was so hard on my nervous system, because I grew up, like, I really had a trauma pathway where I just would not actively say what I really felt or thought, because I knew that would be disgruntling to all of the white people that I was surrounded by, in all of the environments that I was in. It would be too much if I actually spoke the truth. But getting sober, starting this recovery journey from these systems of oppression, that was the call. And so starting to speak the truth, starting to speak my experience, even though everything in me was fighting me to not, and seeing some people be disgruntled by that, losing that relationship with that sponsor, losing so many relationships in the rooms. By the rooms, I mean like the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous, because I was speaking that truth and people were uncomfortable by it, was really, really hard, as somebody who part of how they coped with those systems was people pleasing. And so how I survived was people pleasing, not being really myself and just being what people wanted me to be in order to survive. It was a great grief, but it was also the beginnings of a lot of freedom. I think about how my queerness in that first year of recovery became something that was what I was. Queerness was not just about like who I wanted to sleep with, who I wanted to date, but it was about everything. The whole lens with which I lived my life started to take shape in that first year that I got sober in 2018. And it started to lose relationships. I started to lose relationships with the people that I met in the rooms who were more cis and heterosexual. It completely changed how I socialized, because I was afraid to fully step into my queerness, because I knew that it would cost me a cis heterosexual life. But doing that and losing people, but also gaining tons more freedom, so much more freedom. But then, there was still a lot of cost to self too, because the queer people that I had access to at the time were predominantly white. And so there was still this a bit of contortion, this still bit of people pleasing, of not being fully myself, because of wanting to retain relationships in the way of trying to become as free as possible as a queer person. There's been a lot in terms of the journey of respectability. In 2018, I stopped straightening my hair and started wearing it natural, and just like noticing the fear of doing that in the workplace and how I would be perceived in that way. the fear of like, and putting down the like need to be perfectly manicured, perfectly primed going into work, and just like letting that be, like letting go of those intense expectations, but also losing people in the process, losing people as I just became more and more myself. Another big point of loss that a lot of us may have experienced, or a big collective awakening that may have caused a lot of shifts for our relationships, was 2020. So many things came to light in 2020 that have greatly shaped or changed our relationship to how we relate to each other. There's a couple of things to talk about. There is the pandemic and COVID and collective care. There is race and racial uprisings. And there's also a lot around patriarchy and gender norms that was awakened for a lot of people, as well as class consciousness that was awakened for so many people. And a lot of griefs in terms of connections that we have not processed as a collective. For me, 2020 was a big loss point and a big relational shedding point in terms of race, and really, really abandoning people, institutions that centered whiteness. This is when I really fully stepped away from Alcoholics Anonymous, because I could not stand to be in an institution like that. Like, even though I created BIPOC meetings, like so many BIPOC meetings, like trying to make things work, it just did not work for me to be in an institution that was like fundamentally like white to its core and centered in Christian supremacy and so unwilling to change. So for me, that was like a big abandoning point of the rooms at large and the idea of changing within an institution. I realized in that year that that was not something that was going to work for me. I'm not the kind of person who is born to change institutions from within. That's not my role. There's a big grief. I lost relationships. I lost another sponsor. I lost relationships with white people that I would no longer coddle. I would not leave their whiteness on the wayside of like, oh, they just said something really white and kind of weird. Like, no, I was not holding that anymore. And I confronted that. And people who were not willing to hold that or look at that, those relationships ended. Because I no longer, after a lifetime of shutting myself down and shutting down what I felt, was willing to allow those relationships in my life anymore, where there wasn't the reciprocity of care of somebody holding my full humanity in the way that I was holding theirs. So a lot of relational shedding in 2020 of white people, relationships to white people in my life, of relationships to white institutions. I just fully divested from whiteness and white spaces and retained very few relationships with white people after that. If white folks were not actively working to dismantle the systems and dismantle that within and deconditioning, I cannot hold relationships with white folks in that way. And 2020 and the racial uprisings, like that was really the catalyst for that for me, of just like, this is a hard no. This is a hard no, a hard boundary for me. And it's interesting because I went to a space that I didn't realize would be as white as it was. And it's kind of happened twice this year where I have gone into spaces that are white, or I've gone to a space that was like, it was a Black event, but it was in like a former Confederate town. And honestly, like the reminders of like the spiritual, emotional, and physical harm of being in those spaces, of being in institutionally white spaces, it's interesting to feel now as somebody who on a day-to-day basis is not engaging with those systems, or with in relationship with like people who are expecting me to perform those norms, but going into those spaces and being like, wow, like there really is a heavy impact. There is a really heavy pressure to perform whiteness. And that comes at a real cost to my body, my mind, my spirit. So that's been something that has been freeing, but there's loss with that. And as much as I, on a day to day basis, live in so much more like freedom with those boundaries that I have, I still remember the grief and the loss of those relationships that I had that fell apart because I finally honored like what I fully needed and I was not met in like mutual care in those relationships. So that's a question for you. Did like the events of like 2020 with racial uprisings, with with what's been called like the Great White Awakening, like did that change or shape relationships for you? Another point that's been really grievous in that is that watching people have this Great White Awakening, my platform, I started in 2020, and initially there was a lot of attention because it was like, wow, this person is like speaking the truth, and in this moment we must all hear that. And then in 2021 being abandoned by those same institutions and people because suddenly that truth, that honoring of these systems, that divestment from whiteness was no longer lucrative or no longer what was spotlighted. It was moved away from. And we've seen that overall with the again, DEI historically has just been to center white comfort, but it also doesn't feel good that DEI has actively been divested from in spaces either. That doesn't feel great. Loss with whiteness, with divesting from whiteness, from honoring that, and the loss that comes from that, the loss of income that comes from that, from not coddling whiteness, the loss of people, the loss of relationships, the loss of what felt like warm connections. Freedom on the other side, but loss. 2020 was also big for, I think, many of us collectively in terms of gender and sexuality awakenings. For me, 2020 was when I came into my gender identity as a non-binary two-spirit person, because it was like I no longer had the noise of the patriarchy around me telling me that I should like conform to cis norms, heterosexual norms, in order to survive, in order to be safe, in order to be comfortable. Not having those projections and, working with like spiritual teachers and things and recognizing that this was true for me, that I really am non-binary. It was scary because I kind of had a relationship to it similar to what I had with coming into my sexuality, where I was like, I'm going to lose a lot of people if I lean into this aspect. And that's already a lot because I already have so much going on with my multiple intersectional identities, that all capitalism, colonization, patriarchy, ableism, fat phobia already make it so challenging with all that I am to be who I am. And I'm going to actively lean into this other thing. And it was hard. It was challenging. I was helping start up a lot of Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, and one of them we started up as like a woman of color meeting. And there was like a whole thing in that meeting around gender. And even though most of the people who founded that meeting were actually non-binary people, there was so much pushback and turfiness, turf meaning like trans exclusionary radical feminism, around an acceptance of like gender expansiveness that were really, really painful. And so just recognizing that I was walking away from identity as woman and moving towards being trans, and the grief of that, and the grief that came with losing people, the impact in the relationship to family, and just overall just the pain. There's nothing quite as salient as that pain, because if it wasn't for colonization establishing this gender binary of man and woman, and that you are what you are assigned at birth, and that's what you are, ooh, like I grieve that. It is one of the biggest points of why I move towards collective liberation, like why I fight against colonization and for re-indigenizing, for decolonization, is because I know that those pains, like that pain, that rift in those relationships around gender, around sexuality, are because of colonization, because colonial patriarchy was spread and reinforced through violence. That so many people in our families and our communities like cannot hold us, or that, like the society bears down on us, thinking about the over 500 pieces of anti-LGBTQIA two-spirit legislation that were introduced in 2023 because this is a colonial country. And that grief of just the fact that this patriarchy is so global because of this system, and just knowing that and grieving the fact that like the Dominican Republic, my ancestral lands, or even thinking about, West African countries, like also ancestral lands, like there's so much of this patriarchy that is still held because of colonization. It's like so heartbreaking. And to know that to be fully free comes at this cost of this system that is so resistant to us being ourselves, to everybody being as free as possible, because these gender norms and expectations harm everybody. Everybody has been confined by these systems, but they come at us with violence because we show that it's possible to defy these systems, that actually there is another way, that you don't have to live within the exhausting, controlling, suppressing, self-suppressing systems that tell us that we can't be ourselves and that we should be violent against those who defy these social norms. Painful, painful, painful. So, an invitation to sit with that and to sit with how that's impacted your relationships. What are the relationships that you've lost? I think about all the relationships where, whether they were with, cis het men, or whether they were with queer people and trans people, where there was an expectation for me to perform certain gender norms, and the loss of that, and just grieving those relationships lost because of this discordance, because of patriarchy. And another big collective awakening and grief that came from the lockdown and the pandemic was recognizing disability and neurodivergence and learning about that and seeing how much capitalism has harmed us. Because before the pandemic, there were so many norms of like, you have to go into your workspace and you have to conform with the norms of professionalism, and you better be able to keep up with the pace expected at that job, or else you won't be able to survive. You won't be able to feed yourself, take care of yourself, your loved ones. Like, you won't be able to make it. And, with a daily regimented schedule, like the typical 9 to 5 or more, depending on how much we've been working and what the expectations were. And then to be in the lockdown period and to no longer have that structure, to no longer have that intense pressure breathing down your neck, a lot of us came to recognize our neurodivergence. There was so much, and there still is so much information sharing about what neurodivergence looks like, especially in those of us who were not raised as men and, and white men, because there's also so many nuances of how neurodivergence can present for, those of us who are Black, who are people of color, because of how that intersects with systemic oppression. And it's just, there's so much clarity that came, but it was also such a grief, right? Because as much as like then with clarity came like support, more ADHD diagnosis, autism, more understanding around PTSD. With that also came with a big grief around how do we keep surviving under capitalism? Because these workspaces are not really honoring us as who we are. And maybe, we have historically coped with our neurodivergence with struggles with substances. Maybe we've coped with, filling our body with so much stress to try to get our brains to work at the pace of capitalism, or at the pace that, is expected of how we're supposed to perform under these systems. And that kind of falling away, a lot of discussion about autistic burnout, right? And What does it look like? And can we even continue to work under capitalism? And for a lot of people, recognizing that that was no longer possible, or no longer being able to work in like a traditional workspace. So more of us having to work on our own, myself included, right? Like here I am talking to you with my own business because I can't do capitalism in that same way, without a lot of harm to myself. And so there's just like a lot of grief and pain of that, because wow, we have really lived our whole lives trying to survive a system that has not honored us, right? That is not structured around what we need to be well, and that has shamed us around who we are and how we have functioned. And so there's just that to recognize, and a beautiful freedom in it, in terms of understanding ourselves and each other, and so much clarity in terms of this, but also so much grief because there is still the capitalist pressure and the normativity around how we're supposed to function under it, that so many of us have to face and still are contending with and trying to grapple with, because the system continues to exist. And another thing that has become clear for the collective since 2020 has been around pandemic and collective care. A friendly invitation, if you've been enjoying this episode so far, to give us a like, to subscribe, and to support on Patreon, because I need support to keep this going. I would love to bring in other people, but I want to be able to pay folks. Patreon.com/recovery for the revolution to support us and to sustain this work moving forward. So of course, when we're talking about 2020, we can't talk about that without the giant impact of why 2020 like was so impactful, which was the pandemic, COVID-19, where the whole globe ended up in a period of quarantine, of lockdown, of isolation from each other in order to navigate a global pandemic. And whoo, if this isn't a trauma that has not been collectively processed, and it might deserve its own episode, quite frankly, because there's so much to say about this, but oof, right? And there is so much to process between like the literal impact that COVID has had in terms of like literally losing people, like death. I grew up in Queens, and one of the first people to die from COVID was my high school economics teacher. He died of COVID. And my own family like was impacted by COVID. I almost lost family members. And that was in March, in April. And, you know, when the lockdown period began here in the US empire. So there was just like this very long period of isolation that we experienced and that we do not process, right? And then there's been the aftermath of it, which is that we have had a government that has tried to gaslight us into thinking that this is no longer impacting us. We are a collective of people who have been self-isolated for so long and yet still expected to perform capitalist norms, right? Like we still have to work to live. We still have to keep a roof over our head and a food in our bellies through capitalism. And so there's just a lot of people, and there's so many milestones that were missed, thinking about graduations, thinking about, you know, the births of people, the deaths of family members. I definitely had that where I couldn't attend a family member's funeral because it was in the COVID times, the COVID lockdown times. And again, I just like caught myself, right? And fixed, because there is such a push to pretend like this is not still an ongoing thing. And there is the tension with the fact that that was such a big, traumatic, and isolating time, with the fact that it is still an ongoing, collectively impacting thing. And with the ending of the lockdown portion of this pandemic, it's really, really important to honor how the government shifted us into divesting from or not caring about COVID anymore. because the government, the CDC, it started to pull back its measures in terms of like what are the best practices to keep safe from COVID, in terms of, quarantine periods, isolation periods, in terms of how, like, when is the virus like spreadable, when is it contagious, pulling back those norms, not because the virus was any safer, not because things had changed in terms of transmissibility of the virus, but because they wanted to stop the impact to capitalism that this virus was having and still has, because they wanted people to come to believe that it was fine, that people would be fine, and that they could continue back in the capitalist norms before the pandemic. And, I think about Genocide Joe being like, oh, people aren't masking anymore. So obviously we did such a great job in ending this pandemic. And then watching Genocide Joe get COVID in, the summer of 2024, and that being the end of his campaign for president. COVID is still very much here, and the government has really deliberately tried to condition us to believe that it's not. And that comes with grief, because it's like, as folks who are trying to hold COVID consciousness, it's like recognizing the gaslighting from these systems, while simultaneously grieving how people have been abandoning people, like abandoning each other and abandoning like themselves, right? Because COVID again is so disabling, and we don't know what will be even the long impact, since COVID is a new virus. Like, what is the long impact of getting COVID and getting reinfected with COVID, and the susceptibility to disability and death over time? It's sad to see, and it causes rifts in our relationships. It can make us feel so isolated. And so many of us, like, whether we are continuing to take COVID precautions or if we're not, like, what we are trying to do is just ultimately combat the isolation from these systems that are also born of this government not taking care of us in the beginning of the pandemic, and ultimately abandoning all of us in this process, to where we have to figure things out for ourselves. And that is so challenging, so traumatic, so sad. We are still getting COVID. COVID is still a thing, and it is a mass disabling event. Shout out to Imani from Crutches and Spice, who has been like, this is a mass disabling event, and this is going to greatly impact how society moves forward. Imani talking about the rise of Ozempic and eating disorders in the aftermath of COVID, because of just like all of the pressure to like conform now that like we're outside, and it's like health mitigation efforts like are worse after the pandemic for the collective. And the abandoning of masking has been one of the biggest collective griefs, because masking is a great way that we can take care of each other, by masking, making sure that we're not spreading COVID, whether we're aware that we have it or not, because it can be asymptomatic, or catching COVID and then spreading COVID. So much of this has been abandoned. That has been such a big grief and loss of relationships. It has been such a big tarnishing, because there are so many people who have said that they are for collective liberation, that they are fighting for our, like our collective well-being. But not masking inherently leaves disabled people behind. It makes more of us more susceptible to becoming disabled or to death, because COVID literally attacks our organs. There's long COVID, and there's such like long-term ramifications of potentially getting COVID that are just not honored by our systems, and that people are choosing to ignore. And I get it. It was so lonely, and it still is. It's become even more lonely because people are not caring for each other. So those of us who are still caring like end up being isolated, or those of us who are like disabled or who are immunocompromised end up becoming more isolated, because there are fewer people who are taking precautions. So outside becomes unsafe. I will probably never dance floor make out again, because I don't want to be indoors in a crowded space, unmasked ever again. I don't want to do that. That just feels so deeply unsafe. And we don't talk about that. We don't talk about that impact. But it's also like a grief because so many of us are so lonely. Like, it's so lonely now. How are you supposed to date people? How are you supposed to like see and be seen in collective if spaces are so unsafe? So many of us are struggling to date because COVID has made things so isolating. Either you are being out there and maybe making other people sick or making yourself sick by being out there without any precautions. And so not everyone can participate. Or it's really isolating because you're trying to uphold like what is needed in terms of keeping people safe and keeping yourself safe. And you're seeing that other people are not doing the same. And all of this has just greatly impacted dating. And I'll talk a little bit more about that too as we talk about another big collective grief, which is witnessing over a year of genocide, of mass unaliving, and how much that has also like drawn a line in the sand and really impacted values. Like, Zionism is a form of colonization, right? It is like this project, this belief that is the foundation of supporting the colonization of the whole region that is like known as the Levant, as Swana countries. So, it's not just Palestine, but it's also now we see spreading to Lebanon, Syria, Yemen. Like, all of these places are desired to be colonized under Zionism. Like, that is the focus of Zionism. And so a lot of us have waken up in this past year around the impacts of Zionism, but we also may have lost people, things, institutions. A lot of people have been fired for standing up against Zionism. A lot of people have been doxxed. A lot of people have been literally threatened by their academic institutions. Like, they are paying to be harmed and violated by academic institutions that are fully bought into Zionism. I went to Yale University, and I think about how much I perceived while I was there that if I went against the desires of the institution, I would be met with violence. And seeing that actually happen, like seeing there be violent repercussions, whether in the form of literal police violence or in the form of students being expelled, students being like prosecuted against by Yale University, it was both very validating and also very horrifying. Because why are our students, our young people, being physically, emotionally, spiritually, psychologically harmed by institutions that they are paying money for in order to try to navigate and survive capitalism? Like, these colonial institutions that we're told that we have to go through in order to get ahead, in order to survive, are actively pummeling people down for speaking out against Zionism. And in the last episode of my podcast, I talked about NYU and how they had like their students write essays about how protesting Zionism went against like their code of conduct. So check that out for more. People have lost their degrees. We've seen so many celebrities where many of them are supporting genocide because the funders, their institutions, the businesses that they do business with are deeply in the pockets of Zionism. We've seen some celebrities who have spoken out be blackballed by the industry. So it's just, or like having things come out about them to like try to discredit them. So it's just been a lot. It's been a lot. And so it becomes almost like this checklist of things like, do you still uphold COVID consciousness? Are you against imperialism, Zionism? Like, are you pro Palestinian liberation? Are you pro decolonization and, the tearing down of imperialism? this has become just like a whole thing. And there have been so many impacts to relationships. It was very hard to witness white people not talk about Zionism, not talk about what was happening in Palestine, because again, witnessing what happened in 2020, it's just so easy to watch white people kind of like that Homer Simpson gif, like fall back into the bushes of the comfort of their whiteness. Like they can take off the oppression under white supremacy in the ways that people of color cannot. Like we just can't. We can't. And so witnessing that and grieving and being like, wow, okay, like the few relationships that I've made in between 2020 with white folks, like, nope, like I still need to be really guarded in terms of what I'm witnessing other people's values are. Witnessing, again, rifts with people that we grew up with who were upholding Zionism, and just the grief of that, the grief and the loss of that. And again, with capitalism, there is this big grief because as things have become more financially crunched, and especially since the pandemic began, it's just been a lot, and it's been grievous for a lot of us in terms of we're expected to continue to keep the system going, all while there's active genocide being beamed through our phones, and our phones are being constructed with materials that are harvested through genocide in Congo, right? And just all of that, just the grief of that, our tax dollars going to fund genocide, all while we are struggling to survive, all while we are struggling under the unrelenting pressure of this system. And so just really, really honoring that that is a grief too. And that, you know, maybe the people in our lives don't see it that way, thinking again about family, right? We may come to recognize the impacts of these systems, and especially how they've manifested across time in our lineages. And I have like an ebook, it's called Recovering Under Racial Capitalism, that really has reflections in terms of what the impact has looked like in your lineage that you can get. The link will be in the show notes. But our families, our lineages may not recognize the impacts of these systems in the same ways we do. And that can be a really big collective grief. And, you know, they may not have the time, access, and resource to really like reflect and sit with the impact, or there may be so much trauma that they don't want to look at the impact, and that can be a really big grief too. So just honoring that rift with our family members around these systems, and how these systems are so unrelenting that they keep us from really honoring the grief of how they've harmed us. And this has been refreshed also with the appointing, really, of Kamala Harris as the Democratic candidate. As we are watching so much like communal infighting, I'm like all up in the TikTok streets. So it's like witnessing Palestinians and Black folks like come for each other because of, you know, suddenly like an abandoning of the prioritization of ending genocide and the ending of this imperial harm from the United States, like suddenly not mattering anymore because the person who was appointed, selected, like we did not vote for this person, right? Like the person who was appointed to become the Democratic candidate is Black and South Asian and a woman. And so suddenly we cannot critique this person who has been behind the genocides that we have witnessed for this year, who has caused so much harm to Black community and upholding policing and, you know, the criminal justice system. We cannot critique that, or just watching people just like go gung-ho in supporting this person, and that being a relational grief too, watching people be willing to be like, I'm going to go hard for the empire and support imperial interest just because the face of the empire might become the face of like a Black and South Asian woman. Oh God, that's been such a like big grief. And watching people call people anti-black, being called anti-black for just critiquing Kamala Harris because she is upholding the empire and seemingly moving towards fascism. That's really scary. And it is such a big rupture watching people that you thought were your comrades, who you thought were fighting these systems alongside you, suddenly not. It is like a whole big grief to process, to feel, to witness, to grieve. And again, thinking about dating, like all of this comes into play. In dating, there are so many things I'm vetting for these days because eh, it's just been a whole thing and a whole grief to just witness people really like abandoning each other in order to uphold these systems. And again, there's so much grace because there is so much survival of these systems. There is so much like survival of capitalism. There's been so much cost in terms of how we socialize, how we gather together, how we love, how we connect, that have been impacted by COVID, that have been impacted by white supremacy and patriarchy. There's so much to be grieved and to be felt, but also it has come at so much cost in our relationships. So a big invitation for you to sit with like what resonates from this. What have been the big moments of losing people in your life because you are not upholding and honoring these systems? What are the big things for you that you have noticed? What have been the griefs and losses as you have moved towards collective liberation, and what you have lost in terms of relationships with others? And also, if this has not been like perfect for you, if you have struggled with continuing to mask because you're wanting to connect, you're not wanting to isolate, like how can you hold that? How can you hold that motivation and like see it and witness it? How can you like hold the ways that you may have chosen to uphold these systems and hold them with gentleness while also recognizing the harm that has come from that? And another question for reflection for you is just, does values alignment matter in terms of the relationships that you keep? Family can be one of those points that is really challenging because our families are very likely going to have different values than we do, just generational differences, and in terms of access to support, access to resources like this podcast that are talking about these things, and the access to media that our parents, our grandparents, great grandparents have or don't have. And so it's this question of like, how do we want to move forward in these relationships? Do we want to retain these relationships? Are there boundaries that are needed with relationships with people who have really different values and practices? That's ultimately something to sit with because, some of us may have more capacity or more desire to hold relationships with folks. Some of us, that may be our main, how we are fighting for collective liberation. We may have more capacity and are like, you know what, I'm going to retain these relationships and I'm going to push back against, what I'm witnessing in my family or in my community around upholding these systems. And some of us may not. Some of us may have relationships where that is harmful for us, where that might carry out long-standing patterns of people pleasing and not maintaining our own boundaries, that it's ultimately a self-betrayal to be in that process. And so, or we may not have the spoons or capacity, or we may feel called to make a difference for collective liberation in like a different way. And so it's just really sitting with that and sitting with what you feel called to do. And that can change over time, right? It may feel okay to have like a low contact relationship with somebody, or to be actively working on, facilitating change, opening up people's minds at one moment and maybe not in the next. So just sitting with how do you want to hold relationship with folks who have these different values and practices? Ultimately, in order to get free from these systems, like, we need each other. We need each other in like the deepest ways. I would not have been able to continue to be as like COVID conscious as I have been, as continued to be as deeply rooted in fighting the empire, in fighting Zionism, if I didn't have like the deep community that I do that is continuing to resist these systems. So we need each other. We need to be able to gather and share. And that needs to be accessible locally and also online is so helpful. I am literally able to talk to you, and you all could be from so many places, right? Like so many places in this country, outside of this country. But the internet is gathering us together to share this perspective that we may not hear from the people who are close to us locally. So online connection can help move us, but also in person. And again, how do we make it so that way it is possible for more and more people to divest from these systems, is to also create the space for there to be community, for there to be room for the fact that people have colluded with these systems, and there to be room for people to want to change, right? And we may have different accesses of that work. There may be some people who are more willing to be in those institutions and try to create change. And there are some of us who need to be outside of them in order to be most effective. And so just kind of sitting with that, right? Like sitting with, what is your role? Where are you most able to, and where do you feel most called to create change and to facilitate more of us being able to divest from, dismantle these systems, move away from these systems? Mutual aid is also really essential because capitalism is such a big motivator as to like why people get caught up in these systems, right? Like I started the episode with, capitalism, colonization, systemic oppression. They tell us that if we do not abide by these systems, that we will lose people, places, and things. And we've seen that. We've seen over the years the impact to income, to financial stability, to relationships. Like I've just shared, I have lost so many relationships in pursuit of collective liberation. So we need to create networks of care, of mutual aid, of making sure that people can get their needs met, so people feel like they can leave these systems. So these systems no longer hold the weight and power that they do, that so many people continue to opt in to upholding these systems, even though it makes people sick in the ways that I talked about with like my recovery journey, even though it like costs them their health, their well-being, their soul, honestly, because something I've talked a lot about in like my TikToks and my like reels, my shorter videos, has been, what is the dehumanization cost of continuing to uphold these systems? Like, what must be happening in the bodies of Kamala Harris, of Joe Biden, of, you know, Barack Obama when he was launching all those like drone strikes, right? Of APAC and people who are like staunch Zionists, like what is happening in their bodies that is allowing this to happen, that they are willing to uphold these systems? That comes at a cost. It comes at a cost to hold cognitive dissonance in this way, to uphold and be so like locked up by these systems in our bodies that we are willing to uphold colonialism and capitalism. So all of that needs to be recognized and held and honored, so that way we do not create these systems where people become so dehumanized that they are willing to uphold these systems, or where we have to do this cognitive dissonance dance to try to survive these systems, when really they all need to go. They all need to go. They all need to go. I think about a comrade of mine on the internet was talking about like how the government, you know, shout out to Haven on TikTok, like how our government put us in this like Sophie's choice of all of these shitty options that uphold genocide. And that as we go to the polls this, you know, election season, that we are having to choose between like fascism and genocide. And that is what we are being dealt with. And we have to make it that that is no longer the choice. We must desire more for ourselves, and we must create means for people to opt out of these systems.